open the meeting. This is a workshop for CPA training for the town of Grafton, and we've invited, what towns are you from? Just Upton. Upton is joining us tonight. And Stuart, I will let you
Do my thing.
do your thing.
Okay, thank you, John. And thanks for having me.
Can you just go closer to the microphone,
Sure.
please? Thank you.
Is that gonna work? Get a thumbs up from the booth? Got a thumbs up. I think it was a thumbs up. It was an arm moving.
He's always falling off his chair, so you don't know.
Okay. And
He's
I'll
good,
stay-
he's good.
I'll stay in this vicinity. He's good. Okay, great. And I project pretty good too as well. And thanks to the folks from Upton for coming. We did invite a few other towns. One of them actually Hopkinton has their CPC meeting tonight. And I forget, who else? Maybe.
Northbridge?
What's that?
Wasn't it Northbridge?
No, Northbridge I've been to. I've done
Oh,
their
okay.
training already. It might have been Mendon no one could make it from Mendon. So we'll head out to those places separately. So I've got a presentation on a bunch of things for you tonight. So let me give you an overview of what we're going to talk about. I'd like to start with the state of the state on CPA now, and then talk about the legislation that just passed, which is really exciting and terrific. I don't know if any of you make the webinar we had on that legislation?
I did.
Okay, great. So I included a big chunk of that here as well, which is good. So Joanne, that'll be a review for you. And we'll talk about how that legislation affects the money you're going to get, because it's a real positive contribution. And then a little bit of review for folks on sort of the basic tenets of CPA. Now we've got a couple of veterans in the room. Anyone who's been on a CPC in the 1 to 2 year range, or anyone new?
John and I and Joanne,
No,
1 to 2.
meaning brand new, not
Right.
at least two.
The opposite of you guys.
Yeah, Justin.
Justin's new.
Okay. All right, great. So this will be helpful for you, and a good review of some of the concepts for other folks as well. And I'm happy to do this interactively. So ask questions along the way. I think that works better. Jump right into up at the podium here, but no need to wait till the end to ask questions.
There's no reason for you not to come. We've got 2 free seats, right? I'm not going to be asking any questions. Why don't one of you sit here? Does that make sense? And then you don't even have to move. Is that all right, Stuart?
Sure, absolutely. Wherever you guys
Just
want
grab
to
a
stand.
seat and I'll sit out here and type.
there's a $5 surcharge.
That's all right.
That's right.
Joanne, you could sit in the throne chair.
You can build it down.
And then I might end up on
That's
camera,
it.
Ken. I'm good here. Thanks.
So shy.
All right. So for those of you that aren't familiar with our organization, we're a nonprofit based in Boston, and we're actually just a combobulation of all those other nonprofits that you see on the screen. We've been headquartered at a bunch of them in the past, but for a long time we've been in the offices of the Trust for Public Land. We have folks from each of these organizations that sit on our steering committee. We have some at-large members, and the steering committee just voted actually to double the number of community representatives, so people from local CPCs that sit on our steering committee. And we used to have 4, and they're asking for more. We have 175 communities now. It was time to increase the number of people on our steering committee who come from the CPA communities. You might have seen anyone get the email announcing that opening, so if anyone's interested in joining the steering committee, please send them a little note and respond to that. I think the deadline, is the end of October, because we'd love to have more folks from CPCs on the steering committee. And the things we do, I think, are typical of all the different municipal organizations that your board or committee might belong to. The conservation person is where? Do we have the ConsCom person here? No. Planning board person? Okay, so, the Massachusetts Planning Association, for the selectmen, it would be the MMA, for the ConsCom, MACC. Every board or commission sort of has their statewide trade association, and we're the ones for community preservation committees and communities that have CPA. So our website, our technical assistants are 2 of the big things that probably people know about. But the 2 in blue are what I'm really going to focus on tonight. Our advocacy work at the State House, and to give a little bit of training information on CPA as well. Anyone ever use our website at all? We just redid it last year. It looks very simple, but when you get into it, there is 20 years of information on there. I don't think we've ever removed anything from the website, so it's just chock full of everything you'd ever want to know about CPA. And coming soon, we're just about to upload all our data on CPA elections. The projects are already there, but we're going to upload a statewide statistics, and you'll be able to slice and dice and analyze things. I think it's a lot of fun, but of course I'm a CPA geek to spend time on that website.
Before you get too far, what are the
Yeah.
4 communities, to go back, the
Yes.
4 communities that have the representatives on your steering
Currently?
committee?
Yeah, Newton, Barry Rector has come from Nantucket for 7 years now, and his term is ending, so that slot's gonna be open. John Henshaw from Templeton, and Bob Wagner from Hatfield, and Bob's position is coming up as well. So actually, we'll have 6 slots, the 4 new ones, and then Bob and Barry's term is ending, and they've been on for quite a while, so they're gonna cycle off.
What does the group do?
Well, it varies. There are 4 meetings a year, and they're in Boston. And they're the second Tuesday of the month for 2 hours. And they set the policy of the organization, review the budget of the organization every year, form different committees that work on issues between the steering committee meetings. So there's a legislative committee that would work on CPA legislation. There's a financial committee that work on any financial issues we have. It's a pretty small, lean and mean organization, so there's not any heavy finances going on. They'll make decisions on legislation that we might file to help CPA communities, or decisions on legislation that's been filed that is not to the benefit of CPA communities, and the steering committee will help decide whether we're going to go actively talk to the people at the State House about that. There are lots of little special things that come up along the way, issues that arise that the steering committee needs to dig into a little bit. So one that we've spent a lot of time on, which we're going to talk about in this presentation, is the whole issue of CPA funds being spent on active religious congregations. So a couple of the attorneys on the steering committee have jumped in and helped us, analyze that issue and write an amicus brief that we submitted to the court on that issue. So there's some basic functions of running the organization. We have, 3 full-time staff people, so it's not hands-on in terms of day-to-day running it. But the typical things you'd see on a board, plus little special projects that come up. Does that give a good summary?
Thank you.
All right, great. So back to the website. If you're not a CPA geek like me and you don't want to spend 4 hours on there every single day, the little tab that I've circled in red there, the technical assistance tab, brings up another menu, and that's the place where you'll find anything and everything that you would ever want to know about CPA. So if you're going to spend any time on the website learning a little bit more or doing any research, that's the place to be. So let's talk about what's happening with CPA now. We quietly have advanced CPA to covering half the communities in the state. So you folks, if you adopted in 2002, did you say? Or?
Yep.
Yeah, so you had to be community number somewhere between 38 and 50. I think there were 37 in 2001, and then a few more of the year afterwards when you guys joined. And so now you've been joined by a lot of other communities. And how long is
2003.
Yeah, that's a you up. Actually, there were only 3 communities in 2003. There were so many that passed. Those first 2 years, there was a little bit of a dip. I've never met anyone from the class of 2003. But we're up to 175, which is exactly half the cities and towns in Massachusetts. But because we've gotten a lot of cities lately, it actually represents 60% of the population of the country, of the state. And as you can see down the bottom of there, something that is quite astounding for a voluntary tax increase, but no community has ever left the program. Once they're in it, generally communities are really, really happy with it.
They tried.
Yeah, some communities have tried. I didn't say they haven't tried. We've actually had a bunch of town meeting votes, and we've had 3 times that it's actually gone to the ballot where folks have voted as to whether they wanted to revoke CPA or not in Sturbridge, Northampton, and Hingham.
Just out of curiosity, how many are 3%ers?
About half, well, you know what, I can't say about half anymore. When we were in the 140s, where we were stuck for a while, it was about half. It's about, I think it's 73 or 74 communities. We haven't had a 3% community pass in a long time. I think Great Barrington, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, might have been the last. There's one community that's passed but hasn't implemented yet. Berlin also passed at 3%. So 2 in the last maybe half a dozen years or so are at 3%. Most of the communities at 3% adopted when the economics were a little different. It's much harder to get a 3% vote. So the communities, you're not both at 3, right?
We're at 3.
You're at 3, and
No.
you're,
One-
yeah,
one
that's
and
what
a
I thought. So you can always consider going to 3 if you'd like to. We've had communities do that before. You can adjust your
Only if
schedule.
John opens his checkbook.
It's empty.
So no.
So we're going to talk about the CPA checkbook in a minute. So this is my favorite map of Massachusetts. This is the one that has all the CPA communities on it. The green ones are the towns, and the orange ones, which number I think close to 30 or so, is the cities. And the cities have very much finally taken a little shine to CPA. In the beginning, it was really hard to get such a diverse electorate in a city to vote on a voluntary tax increase. A much tougher vote than it is in a rural town or a suburban town. But they've seen the success of it, and lately we've had a lot of the cities jump into the program, which necessitated some work up at the State House on our trust fund formula, which we're going to talk about. Any way you look at CPA, whether you look at that map or you look at these numbers on the projects, it's been a huge success. These are the data on how many projects and acres and housing units have been constructed through the end of fiscal 18. So these are actually 1 year old. The deadline was last week for communities to report their FY19 projects, and so in about 2 weeks we'll have all that information. And I expect it will definitely be over 30,000 acres of open space that have been protected. The total number of projects probably will hit about 12,000. There's now anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 projects every year that are passed in CPA communities. And the thing that people are always surprised about is when you add up all the money that's been raised in the 19 years, it adds up to $2.1 billion between the local money and the state money. So the program has become a lot larger than anyone envisioned I think it would ever be. I don't think people ever dreamed that number of communities would vote a voluntary tax increase. I don't know if any of you worked on your campaigns in your towns, but a lot of times it surprised even the people who were advancing the idea that it passed, because it's very difficult to get communities to vote a voluntary tax increase. But that just shows how much communities believe in these 4 areas.
In the early days, the 100% match was an attractive
Yes, it was.
factor.
Which was a complete accident, by the way. The calculations were made to try to bring in about a 50% match, sort of to be similar to all the state grant programs that are usually come with matching funds. The number of communities that passed in the beginning was modest, and the communities were all small or medium-sized. And at that moment, the trust fund just was flush with money from all the refinancings that were happening as interest rates were going low. And if you remember back then, it was the time when people would buy a house and put a little money into it and flip it 3 months later, and then buy another one and flip that one. That was we all paid for that with a huge recession. But that generated a lot of money at the Registry of Deeds, and so the trust fund, the very first year, brought in $53 million. It's down to 24, 25 now, so it's been cut in half from those go-go days. But that's what led to the 100% match. But it was really a surprise, and actually probably one of the worst things that happened to CPA in one respect, because when it started to fall, there was a negative connotation on the program, when in fact it had never expected to be 100%. So people were blaming the state for changing the formula or cutting the amount of money they were giving, when the formula has never changed, and it's always been the same. So it was a little bit of a perception problem. And then once it fell, communities, a lot of them lost interest. Whereas I think if it had been 50% all along, you would have had a guaranteed 50% match for probably 12 years, as opposed to 6 years at 100%, and then it fell off a cliff. So, but the money's all the same. So in the communities that got in early, and I'm speaking to communities that got in early, that was a very smart move. So, all right, so let's talk about the trust fund, because you know that you raise your local money here with CPA from your surcharge on your property taxes, but the big attraction, whether it be at 100% or somewhat less, is this state trust fund. And it is a true trust fund administered by the Department of Revenue. The money for it comes by and large not from the state budget. It's a dedicated fee that was added specifically for CPA by the legislature in 2000, and it's a surcharge on every document that's filed at the Registry of Deeds. Almost all documents have a $20 surcharge. Municipal lien certificates have a $10 surcharge. And that money goes directly to DOR, deposited in the trust fund, and the only thing they can do with that money is pay it out to you folks and my town. I live in a CPA town on the North Shore as well, every November 15th. They cannot spend it on anything else, and it is not subject to appropriation, meaning the legislature doesn't have to vote every year to let the money go. It's automatic. Probably any other program in the entire Commonwealth would love to have a funding source like that. It's pretty darn unique for something not to be subject to appropriation by the legislature. Even in your town, there aren't too many programs. Everything usually goes through town meeting. There aren't too many places where money flows in and it automatically flows out. But that's what happens with CPA, and it's terrific. But unfortunately, as the number of communities has grown and as the collections at the registry have dropped by about half because of the real estate activity, we were down last year to a 13.8% base match. Now, 3% community got more than that, and we got some surplus money, which we'll talk about a little bit more, but we were able to get another 10 million added to that because it was so low. That's something we worked on a lot recently, is try to get state budget surplus dollars at the end of the year and have some of those transferred into the trust fund on October 31st, right before the matching checks go out. So last year we were able to get 10 million, and that brought the match up to 19%, but that's not a great match. Long term, I think it would hurt the program if it stayed that low. I think people would start to question whether it was worth it to stay in their program, and it would be legitimate to do that. So we knew the long-term trend wasn't good, and we went to work back in 2007, actually, on this legislation. And there are still 5 people that worked with the legislature for, 12 years to get this bill passed. So you think, if any of you have had any experience getting anything passed at the legislature, you would probably understand that the wheels turn very slowly of municipal and state government and federal government too, and especially when you're talking about money. So believe it or not, 12 years to work on that trust fund with these folks who I'm the only staff person. The other 4 are steering committee members who are real active up at the legislature and so helped us with that legislation. We worked on it so long, this was the first meeting of that group we had. That's what we looked like at the very first strategy meeting. It was a long time. So we also had help, obviously, from our staff, and so you can put the face to the name. Chase and Caitlin are the 2 other people at the coalition, and we've had 2 associate directors over all those years, only 2, and Kathy Roth and Allison Leary. That position is open now, and so the steering committee will help figure out what we're going to do with that position, whether we're going to restructure it, or we're going to figure that out in the next in this fiscal year. So that's it. That's the only staff and myself that's ever been at the coalition. So it's really, we don't have a lot of turnover, that's for sure. So as I mentioned, the steering committee folks had a big part in the legislation, but we went beyond and built up an incredible coalition of organizations in all the different areas of CPA: recreation, the environment, housing, and historic, to work on this legislation. And these folks all realize how great CPA is and provided a tremendous amount of help. And still, it took 12 years to get it done. We also hire professionals. This is Bob Durand, and I put him in there as a grandpa with his new grandson, which just happened this year, because I call him the grandpapa of CPA. Bob actually wrote the CPA legislation in the 80s. He's from, right down the road in Marlboro. And he was secretary, he was a House member, senator, secretary of the environment under Governor Cellucci and Jane Swift, and then became a legislative agent and has worked with us ever since on getting this legislation passed. And then as we got closer toward the end, we brought in a couple more firms because you really do need professional help to get things passed up at the legislature. There are 200 people in that building that have to all be convinced to do something, and that is a really tough task for a small little organization. So it's nice to have some professionals on the team as well. And although there are 200 legislators, there are always some key ones that really make it happen. And over the 12 years, this is really the 9 folks who really dug in and did more than just saying they'd sponsor our bill or that they support it, but actually worked very hard to get it done. And the 3 at the top were sponsors of the bill at various points along the way. Senator Cream, Representative Kulik, who retired last year, and Margaret Ferrante, who's from Gloucester, who's a rising star up at the State House on the House side. And believe it or not, we've had great support right at the top from the Senate President, Karen Spilkel, who's right down the road here. The brand new House Ways and Means Chair, Aaron Michaelwitz, is from Boston, and that really helped. So, in fact, Boston adopting CPA was probably the reason why, in the end, we got this bill passed, because now the entire Boston legislation was pushing for it, whereas before they didn't really care, and it just so happens that a member of the Boston delegation ended up as House Ways and Means Chair, which is a key position for any kind of money bill. We even had, it's a very bipartisan issue. The minority leaders, Bruce Tarr and Brad Jones, head of the Senate Republicans and House Republicans, have been huge supporters of CPA in this legislation. So it's one of those true bills that really is bipartisan and makes things happen. The person down in the bottom left corner, the Speaker of the House, is the final decision maker on most anything, and that took the longest to bring him on board, but he doesn't live in a CPA community. That probably didn't help. But in the end, the Speaker usually does what his members want him to do. And so after 12 years of his members telling him that they wanted this, we got it done. So these are the different steps across the field. The planning started actually before I even joined. I joined the coalition in 2006. We did have a bill pass in 2012. You might all remember that. It was a huge bill, actually, a comprehensive rewrite of a lot of the things communities have been asking for with CPA, like the right to rehabilitate existing parks, playgrounds, and athletic fields. Before 2012,
yeah.
you could only build new ones. You couldn't fix up the ones you have, which was something we all wanted to fix. And that bill was filed with all those changes and the money piece. And when it came out of committee late at night, after 5 years, everything was intact except the money piece. so it was a partial victory. We got all these great changes for the program, but we really had to start from scratch on the money piece. So from 2013 till now, the bill that we've been working on didn't have any policy issues at all, no changes to CPA. It was a 1-paragraph bill that said, let's increase the money at the Registry of Deeds. Let's finally, after 20 years, make an adjustment in those fees to bring in more money for the trust fund. And I think the reason why it passed, as I mentioned, the popularity of CPA in the building was huge. Municipalities, mayors, selectmen, all jumped on board. We had a letter that was signed by, I think, 110 different chief executives, from mayors to boards of selectmen. There was really little opposition at all outside the building. A lot of times big lobby firms from other constituents come in, but we really had no opposition. And then the grassroots people, you probably got sick of me writing emails saying, please call your rep, please call your senator, please send in an email. It takes a lot of that, but when you go to a legislator, the first thing they're gonna say to you is, I haven't heard a hue and cry for this. I haven't heard my constituents telling me about that this is a problem. And if they don't get constantly reminded something's a problem, it's not on their radar. But the biggest factor, I think, for CPA, honestly, is that most of the projects that you appropriate money for end up creating lots of jobs. Building affordable housing, building parks and playgrounds, rehabbing beautiful historic buildings like your town hall, Yeah, pretty much everything except for buying open space creates jobs with CPA. And we really hammered that home at the State House, and it was a really key to our victory. So, what exactly passed? It was very simple. It was an adjustment finally in those fees that the legislature created in 2000. Those fees had never been adjusted. So, someone was filing a deed or a mortgage at the legislature back in 2000, they were paying $20 on top of their regular filing fee, which went to CPA. Right now, still today, if you go to record a deed or a mortgage, there's going to be a fee. The fee's going up dramatically that goes to the state, but the $20 on top for CPA is still $20. It's never been adjusted. So that will go to $50 on January 1st, and the municipal lien certificates will go from 10 to 25. And those changes, like I said, will happen on January 1st. The bill actually called for them to happen on November 1st, but the legislature felt they needed a little bit more time for the registries to change their systems and post signage and things like that. So what will that mean? Well, the trust funds right now is bringing in about 24 or 25 million. It's actually down about $1 million this year. If you know what's going on in the real estate market, prices are really good, but there's not a lot of volume on the market. There's just not a lot of transactions. Anyone in real estate here? No? But you know that. You've seen that. And so the trust fund has really been hovering in the mid, $20 million range, 24 to 27 million. It's been right in that range for probably 6 years now. The new fees we're estimating will bring in about 36 million. So in total, the trust fund will have about $60 million every single year to pay out to communities. So it's a significant increase and a long time coming. So how does it all work? Well, we have one more match at the old fee level before the new money kicks in. So on October 31st of this year, they'll take everything that's in the trust fund and pay out a match to you on November 15th. A new, what we call a 12-month trust fund year, begins every November. And so they collect the money from November through October 31st, and they send you a check on November 15th. So the new fees will not kick in until December 31st. So we'll have 2 months of our trust fund year at the old level and 10 months at the new level. We had tried, as you can see now, we had tried to line it up so we'd have 12 months of the new fees. But we're only going to get 10 months of that. So next year's match in November 15th, 2020 will be significantly higher than this year, but it won't be the full 12 months worth of collections at the new fees. The first time you'll get that is in 2021. So what does that mean for you folks? Well, it's really hard to predict the future on the trust fund because every year what you folks collect locally goes up. So the claim you put in on the trust fund goes up because you get a percentage of what you raise locally. We don't know if any new communities will adopt CPA. We will not have a new community this year for only the second time in the history of the program. Folks realized that the match wasn't that great and no one was really interested in CPA, but the phone is ringing off the hook now for 2020. So I do expect there are going to be some new communities in 2020. And also, you never know what's going to happen at the registry. I can't imagine the level of activity at the registry going lower than it is now. So I think that will be positive. I think, at some point the market will loosen up a little bit and some more houses will come on the market and things will start moving a little bit better, and that should be good things. But you can see those variables make it very hard to determine what the match will be going forward. So what we did is we went backward. And that's really gives a better illustration, we think, of what the trust fund will bring to your community. So we redid last year's calculation. The check you received in November of 2018, we put the new revenue into the spreadsheet and then redid that distribution to give you an idea of how this new money would have affected that payout had that been in place at the time. So you can see in Grafton, last year you got 13.8%, which was the base match. If we had that new revenue in there, a full year's collection, you would have gotten 33%. So you can see it's a significant increase. And in Upton, because you have the 3%, you get extra money from the trust fund. So you got 27.2% last year, and you would have gotten 65% had the new money been in place of the trust fund. And we also looked at it in terms of absolute dollars. So these are the amounts that you received last year: 59,000 in Grafton and 117 in Upton. Had the trust fund been in place, Grafton would have gotten 140,000 and Upton 282,000. We didn't factor any surplus money in here at all. This is just money from the Registry of Deeds fees. Yeah.
So are these amounts for fiscal 2021?
No, we went backwards.
So
So
is this 2020?
nope, this
No,
is
it would have been.
yeah,
What
we
would-
redid last year's calculation.
Just showing you what it would have been.
Okay,
As I said, it's really impossible to do a forwards-looking
certainly.
calculation. And we leave that to DOR. They're the ones that do the estimating, and even they won't tackle it until they're 6 months into a year, so they do an estimate every March. We didn't want to wait till next March to find out, just to give people a rough idea of what the impact would be. So this seemed like the next best thing to sort of indicate what the match would have been last year had the new money been in place.
Do Hopkinton, Mendon, and Upton have 3%? Is that why their distribution
Let's
is
go back
so
to the
large?
percentages, I can tell either. So Northborough, Hopkinton, and Grafton are all at less than 3%. I can't tell you exactly off the bat. Mendon and Upton have 3%. So if you are at less than 3%, you all get the same. So the 85 communities or so that are at less than 3%, they all got the same amount on the first round, 13.8% of what they raised locally. They got the same percentage amount, not the same dollar amount. So, Boston's at 1%. They raised 19 million.
19 million.
So they got 13.8% of 19 million. The smallest community is Gosnold. Does anyone even know where Gosnold is?
It's in the western part, isn't it?
No, that's Granville. We have
Granville.
Granville too. They're the second smallest.
On the
Okay, so
way,
it's
on
up
Route
in the
2.
north.
Nope, not on Route 2.
No,
This is
isn't it-
fun.
Isn't it in the Merrimack Valley area?
No, not in the Merrimack Valley.
Are they up in the
Oh, it's-
the
it's-
northwest corner, right?
No, it's on
About
it's
as
on one
far
of
as
the
you could
islands.
possibly be.
on one of the islands.
On your third guess. Anyone ever heard of Cuttyhunk?
Yes.
Yeah.
Cuttyhunk is one of the islands in the town of Gosnold. It's called the Elizabethan Islands, I think. So, you got Nantucket way out here, and then Martha's Vineyard, and then sticking out from
Yeah.
Woods Hole
Honest to God.
is the Elizabethan Islands, and the last one is they're all the town of Gosnold, but the last one is Cuttyhunk, where there were 50 people at town meeting that when they adopted CPA, they get $5,000 a year from CPA total, and so they got 13.8% of $5,000. And if you are at 3%, then you get into the second and third round of funding, which has additional money.
Whole different deal.
And the second and third round are not equal like the first round is. The first round, everyone gets the same, 13.8% last year. The second and third round are weighted, and they are weighted to favor small communities and less affluent communities. So if you're Cambridge and you're at 3%, you're going to get just a tiny bit from rounds 2 and 3 because you're so large and you're so affluent. Whereas communities in the western part of the state, like Granville, if they get 13% on the first round, they'll go right to 100% by the end of round 3 because it doesn't take many dollars to get them from 13.8% to 100%. So it really does. It works. The second and third round work, but only if you have adopted at 3%.
So I have a quick question that's
Yeah.
but further back. We don't need to change the sides. The Registry of Deeds money that goes into the CPA trust, is that statewide for every town that
Yes.
these things, or okay?
So the registries aren't by town. We
Yep.
have, I think, 24 registries in the state.
Yeah.
So they're by regions. And the deal with CPA is everyone pays into the trust fund, and every community has an opportunity to adopt CPA and draw out of the trust fund if they want to. So it is a surcharge on every document filed at every registry in the Commonwealth.
Okay.
Good question. All right, so that was part one of what was signed into law by Governor Baker on July 31st. Part 2 was this surplus money. So, like I said, we've been advocating for money from the state budget surplus really ever since 2012. Ever since that bill passed without any money in it, we said, well, look, we're going to start from scratch and try to raise the deeds fee again, but we've got to figure out something now to help communities because the match is going really low. And what we worked on with the legislature was dedicating some surplus money. So there may be $20 million in this year's match in a month and a half, and I'll explain that in a second. But first, here's the history of surplus money. So remember I said that legislation passed in 2012. So in 2013, we worked at the legislature to bring along some extra money. It wasn't permanent. It was just that 1 year. They had a budget surplus. They had a big one, and so they put $25 million in the budget for us, and we got that $25 million that year. The next year, they put $25 million in the budget, but when the surplus was actually calculated, there wasn't enough, so we got $11.4 million. Then we got $10 million the following year. The 2016 and 2017, they promised us $10 million in the budget, but at the end of the surplus, at the end of the calculations, when the state closed its books, there was no surplus. So we got nothing. And then last year, we got $10 million again. So there's the history. So, it's not an insignificant amount of money. What is that? I think it's 64 million, I think, 25, 36, 46,
56.
$56.4 million over these since 2013, which is really, that's all been paid out to the communities 100%. So now we're talking about 2019 and what's going to happen this year. And if last year's base match was 13.8, this year is going to be even lower than that because, people's local surcharge goes up every year, so the trust fund falls a tiny bit, even if all things are equal. So, so we asked for $20 million this year because if any of you've been following politics, the state ended with a $1 billion surplus this year for the second year in a row. By law, the majority of that, I think something like $800 million, goes to the state's rainy day fund, the stabilization fund. There's a calculation that says if capital gains revenue comes in over an X amount, everything over that amount goes automatically to the stabilization fund, which is a very good thing. So it's not as big as you would think in terms of what they have discretion to spend. The fascinating thing is if Upton or Grafton ended June 30th, your fiscal year, with a $1 billion surplus, let's say a $1 million surplus, that's it, right? On June 30th, the town would close their books sometime over the summer, and that $1 million would fall into your free cash. The state, however, can continue spending out of last year's surplus in July, August, September, and October. So they are still spending that $1 billion they had as a surplus in FY19, which ended on June 30th. So it's quite different than what they let the town. They won't let the cities and towns do that, but they do it. They do a final spending bill in probably any day now, probably in early October. They will pass one more bill to spend the rest of that surplus. We hope that they don't spend everything, because our surplus is after the real surplus. So there's $1 billion, but then $800 million goes to the stabilization. They'll spend $40 million on heating oil assistance. They'll probably decide to spend $10 million on road and ice deposits to stabilize that fund. The sheriffs will need more money, and they'll start spending in this final bill. And if they spend the entire $1 billion, when the calculations are done by the comptroller at the end of the year, he'll say there's nothing left for what's called the consolidated net surplus. But when we hope that they're actually only going to spend $999 million, I can't even figure it out. How do you subtract 20 million from 1 billion? I can't even do the math. But we hope they leave behind $20 million. And then the comptroller will do a calculation and give us the consolidated net surplus. But it's not even that easy, because when the budget was passed and they gave us the 20 million, they actually gave another program 10 million, and they put them in order. So, for the consolidated net surplus to work, there has to be actually $30 million left over after they're all done with their spending, because the first 10 million will go to the state's life sciences program, and then the next 20 million will go to us. So, we're still working on that. So we're up at the State House pretty often this time of year, trying to convince them that the surplus is necessary, because if we don't get it, you will have a record low match this year by far. Because last year we got 10 million, so you got a 19% match on the first round. You got more. But if we don't get any surplus this year, it'll be 12, 13%, something like that. It'll be by far a record low. So let's hope we're successful on that, and let's hope that when they have a little spending spree in this final budget bill that they're doing, that they leave behind $30 million for life sciences and CPA. So that's what we've been doing for the past 12 years. Doesn't feel like we've done anything else but this legislation, but we've obviously done a lot more things than that. Any questions on the trust fund or the money or the bill that just passed or the timing of it? Anything that you guys are now understand something that maybe 30, 40 other people in the entire state understand, believe it or not, how the trust fund works and how it's going to work in the next couple of years. So congratulations. So I wanted to do a little bit of a recap on some of the most important things that a CPC does, Community Preservation Committee. Some of them, you know, after a long time, you know, you kind of forget what are the important things to be doing sometimes. Sometimes CPA was set up a long time ago and you missed a few steps in the beginning. I know my community didn't really understand we had to write a community preservation plan until like year 12 of our having CPA. So it's always good to take a little bit of a step back and you know, understand some of the basic things that are most important to CPA and some of the basic tenets of it. So obviously a CPC has a lot of tasks. You all hold a public hearing every year? You all do that?
Multiple sometimes.
What's that? More than one sometimes. Yeah, that's good. That step is missed by a lot of people. You'd be surprised. And you're supposed to have written a community preservation plan and sort of keep that current every year. And you hopefully are all getting financial information from
Every
your
month.
town
Every month.
to review that periodically. And then the bottom two things are really why you exist. To prepare a budget for passing at town meeting of what's going to happen with that CPA money, and to recommend specific projects. That's really the core of what you do. So let's talk about the annual budget a little bit. This is actually the thing we get by far the most questions on from people who are brand new to CPA or have had it for, you know, been on their CPC since 2001. These questions on the budget just come over and over and over again. So it's a good thing to look at. Most communities do the budget, you know, in the same time frame you do your town budget in the spring, but we do have a couple, and it's not a bad idea that actually do it in the fall.
We do it.
Rockport has always has a standing special town meeting every fall. This wouldn't work unless you had a special town meeting every fall, or unless you were a city, where the city council meets, you know, every week or two. But Rockport's rationale was really interesting. They said, you know what, we always have a town meeting in the fall. If you've ever been around municipal government in the spring, it's crazy season. It's just Looney Tunes. You know, everything, it seems like everything happens right before town meeting, and every controversy that's possible to come up in a town comes up right before town meeting. You know, the budget takes all the oxygen out of the room usually at town meeting. So, you know, they do their regular budget in the spring, and they do all their CPA budget and their projects in the fall. And it works really well for them. And Cambridge does the same thing, and we have probably, you know, it's definitely a minority number of communities, maybe a dozen or so. But it's an interesting strategy that they use to sort of put the spotlight on CPA in the fall. But like I said, it will not work unless your town has a standing, you know, by bylaw special town meeting automatically every fall. You do have to make a recommendation on the budget to town meeting, even if there are some things in there that you have to do, like a debt service payment. You still have to make that recommendation on the budget to town meeting. So you have to vote on it at one of your meetings. And to figure out the budget, you know, it's based on your top line number, which is your local revenue estimated and the estimate that you're gonna get from the state match. And you all realize that you get your state match a year after you collect the local money. So you collect the local money through June 30th, you tell DOR how much you collected, and they send you the match on November 15th. It's based on what you collected the previous year, but it's revenue to the current year, because you're physically receiving that check on November 15th. So the check you're gonna get November 15th this year is based on what you collected in FY19, but it's gonna be revenue to your FY20 budget. Does that make sense to folks?
Yeah.
Okay. So you add those two together, the estimated local money and the estimated state money, and that's your sort of top line number on the budget. And then CPA has surprisingly few rules on what you have to do. It's terrific. You really have a lot of flexibility on what you do with your money every year. All the law says is you have to spend or reserve 10% for housing, open space, and recreation. They share that reserve account, and historic. And sometimes people don't realize it's spend or reserve, not spend and reserve. So if you are going to town meeting and you have a housing project, let's say you have $100,000 in total revenue, which means you are required to spend or reserve $10,000 for housing, and you're going to town meeting with a housing project that's $50,000, you don't also then have to put $10,000 in the housing reserve. That $50,000 takes care of your requirement for housing that year. So it's spend or reserve 10% of your total budget for each of those categories. That doesn't mean you can't. You know, some communities just like to put the 10% in automatically and then do their projects. That's fine. You can put an additional 10% in if you want, over and above that. A lot of communities do that, but the rule is spend or reserve. You don't have to do both. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. And then, of course, the balance, you know, you might allocate a little bit to administrative. Almost every community does. Up to 5% of the money can go to the administrative account. And then the balance you can spend in any different category, any particular project that you want. So, any questions on that? Okay. So let's actually look at a budget. Everyone does their budgeting differently. You know, communities have different formats. This is a format that, you know, DOR has a suggested budget article format, which I'm happy to send to anyone, but usually by now you've developed the pattern of how you do it in your community, and it doesn't have to be done any particular way. But if, let's say you had a $100,000 budget, you're expecting $100,000 in revenue between the local money and the state money, you, let's say you had no projects, you would put 10,000 in each of the 3 reserve accounts. You would put maybe $5,000 toward your administrative account. And so that would leave you with what, 65,000. And you could have spend that entire 65,000 on projects if you wanted to, as well as the 30% in the other categories. But let's say you had no projects that year. So you have $65,000 in expected revenue next fiscal year. You should put that in something called a budgeted reserve. Does anyone use a
Yeah,
budgeted
we-
reserve?
Well, in
If-
fact, that's what the warrant article says. It goes into a budgeted reserve.
Right.
We just use it undesignated funds,
Yeah,
sort of
it
kind of stuff.
is an undesignated budget reserve. Do you guys use one here?
We call it
Yes.
fund balance for CPA purposes.
So the fund balance technically is actually another account.
Then we don't use the budgeted reserve.
Okay, the fund balance is what's left over from previous fiscal years that you haven't spent. So the budgeted
We have something
reserve-
called
The carried over
For-
non-reserve funds.
for any CPA purpose.
It does say that, okay, so
Fund for
probably just-
any
sort of a-
CPA
user
purpose, don't we?
friendly title,
Yeah.
it's not the title of the
Yeah.
thing.
So like for
But
this,
it
May
explains what
town
it is.
meeting,
Uh-huh,
we're going forward with 4 warrant articles.
this
on-
coming May.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
the 3 reserve, and then the fiscal year 20 revenue.
Joanne, why don't you sit up here, because they can't hear you.
So for this town meeting, we have 4 articles, 3 of them are the reserves, and then the remaining money is going into what we call fund balance for CPA purposes. the remaining fiscal year 20,
That's
Revenue.
That consists of the revenue items and, any payments that we take out of them
Right.
and the reserves.
Okay,
And the remainder of the revenue after we take away those things goes into that account.
so the only thing that you might want to clean up is to use the same terminology as DOR, and we can talk about that as you prepare
Okay.
your.
That would be good.
The fund balance is actually technically a different account. The fund balance is what is left over at the end of the fiscal year. So when the town accountant closes your CPA accounts, what's in the 3 reserve accounts stays there.
right?
Everything else that you haven't spent drops into what's called a fund balance.
And
So-
that was
Right.
what happened with the
Right,
auditors.
and so it would be very good to,
Yes.
to have our terminology align with the standard, because
Right.
it doesn't right now.
Right,
Yeah.
I'm gonna,
We have that fund, but we just call it something else.
Great, and it does get confusing for us when we try to help communities, or for your town accountant when they talk to DOR, is, people use different
Yeah.
terminologies.
I have a
The,
question.
the names we use actually don't make any sense.
They don't make
But
me say, well, they were just.
they
kinda
do to
made
us
up.
though.
You said something that just triggered something.
They're
If
not
you
descriptive.
put money aside for a project and you don't use it all, what we have done is take it back to the account from which it came.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, money always, whether, there's 2 situations where that would happen. You appropriate money to a project and the project is canceled. It never happens for
Yep.
whatever reason. Or you go ahead with the project and there's $1,247 left. It always has to go back to the account from which it was
Okay,
appropriated.
that's what we've been doing. I
Yeah.
just wanted to make sure that was correct.
Which makes it incumbent upon you, when you recommend projects, that you don't just recommend the project, that you recommend what account
Yes, we always.
you're recommending the
Yeah.
project to come from.
Yep.
So to appropriate $75,000 to build a park, from the open space reserve, from the fund balance, from the budgeted reserve, from next year's anticipated revenue. There's a number of different accounts, and unless you specify that, if there's money left over, the town accountant's gonna put the money wherever she or he wants to, and that's not what you want to have happen. It's not what the law says should happen either, so.
Okay.
You don't want anyone else making that decision for you. That's the CPC gets to make that decision on where money comes from and where it would go back to.
We show them the minutes of each meeting when we vote to put the money back into the funds.
Great.
The town accountant wants to see it in the minutes.
Yeah, he
Right.
he really runs a pretty tight shop.
Oh, that's
so-
great.
So
What gets really tricky is if you appropriate a project, with 50,000 to come from the housing reserve and 75,000 to come from the fund balance, which is an undesignated account, and then there's $3,000 left over.
Where does it go?
Where does it go?
I would proportionately
Yeah,
take it
it's
back. to
proportionately
where-
done, yeah.
Yeah,
That's actually the wrong answer.
it is.
Yes. I would have recommended that, and I probably told about 1,000 people that answer. And because I didn't think there was an answer, but in fact, there is an answer to
Okay.
that. What DOR says is it goes back to the most restrictive account first.
Oh, okay, so if it came out of a specific reserve account like historic, it would have to go back to historic.
Right. So if 25,000 came
Okay.
from the historic account and the rest from undesignated money, and there was 3,000 left over, it would all go to the historic reserve.
Okay, that's
If there was
That makes sense.
30,000 left over, 25 would go to the historic reserve and 5,000 would go to the undesignated money.
Why that split?
Well, if you appropriated 25,000 from
Yep.
the historic account
Yep.
and 75,000
Oh,
from another
okay.
account.
So using the same ratio.
Yeah, and if there was
I got it,
30,000
I got it,
left,
got
you'd
it,
put
got
that 25,000 back in the
Yeah.
historic account, because that's the most restrictive account.
Okay, that makes
So,
sense.
I don't think you're gonna get in any trouble whatsoever if you do it a different way. That is probably the most obscure CPA fact that I have in my head. There's nothing more obscure than that.
Okay.
And it's so obscure, we actually didn't put it in any of our trainings, we don't put it in any of our newsletters, it's just one of those things that would usually makes most people's mind go. So we can work together on that,
Okay.
for it's for FY '21 you're doing a budget, right?
Yeah.
We're in FY '20, so
Yeah.
this coming
Yes.
spring you'll do FY '21. Yeah, okay, great. All right, so the administrative account, you're probably familiar with that. Do you set aside the full 5%
No.
You don't do that? You do?
We
Yeah.
do, we set aside
A set amount.
a set amount, and
Yeah.
then whatever is left over goes back into the undesignated or the, you know.
Fund balance.
Yeah, unbalanced, yeah.
Or undesignated fund
Yeah,
balance.
yeah.
That's the two ways people do it. Either they have a set amount they're comfortable with every year, or they put in the full 5%, and it really doesn't matter because whatever you don't spend, and typically you have a lot of administrative money left over, goes back to the undesignated fund balance at the end of the year. And the important thing to remember is that account is for your expenses, your committee's expenses. It is not the administrative account for Grafton's CPA program or Upton's CPA program. It's your committee's administrative account. So there's a big difference. So if the town clerk has some expenses on CPA, they have to file all the paperwork on a land purchase you did, or they have to, the assessor's office process a bunch of applications for the low income exemption, or the selectmen have a question for legal counsel on CPA, and the lawyer has to spend some money on it. Those expenses have to be borne by the different departments out of their administrative budgets, because your administrative budget is for your committee's use. It is not the expense account for the entire town's use on the CPA issues. Does that make sense? And that will protect you a lot, because typically the CPA administrative account, because you don't know what you're gonna face that year and you set aside 5%, you know, when you get deep into the year and someone wants to do something related to a CPA category, usually that's the only money around, you know, so the Conscom wants to do something related to open space and they say, can we have some administrative money to, you know, hire a wetland specialist to go, you know,
okay.
look at a piece of invasive species on a piece of land we acquired with CPA? Well, that has nothing to do with running the Community Preservation Committee in Upton or Grafton. That's a conservation commission function. I mean, once CPA just bought the land, now it's town conservation land, and they have to take care of it. So it's a good thing to remember, because sometimes you will get requests from folks
What
to
about,
access your
for
fund.
example, we did a project, we funded the project, we forgot to include funding for a sign at the project. Oh, well, we'll just pay for that out of our administrative budget.
Well, technically, you're not supposed to.
Really?
And the reason is, the administrative account can do any sort of due diligence on projects before town meeting. So if you need an appraisal on a piece of land, or meets and bounds on a piece of land, you know, anything to get ready for town meeting is fair game for the administrative budget. But once town meeting gives you a budget for a project, that's the entire amount of money that the town has said you could spend on that project. So if you go to supplement that money
Okay.
with something you forgot from the administrative account, you really have overruled what town meeting said.
Yep.
And if you think about it, every expenditure has a threshold where town meeting is gonna flip from saying yes to no. You know, we wanna buy this land, it's $1 million. Town meeting goes, we wanna buy this land, it's $1.25 million. Town meeting goes, we wanna buy this land, it's $1.3 million. Now, two guys stand up and say, you know, that's kinda getting to be a lot of money. We wanna buy this land, it's 1.5 million, and town meeting says, no way. You don't know where that line is, where town meeting would have said, you know, that's a lot of money on that project. So that's why, once the town meeting sets the budget for that project, if you forgot something, technically you should go back to town meeting. Signs are one thing where I think you can probably be okay, because one of the main purposes of signs is to let the citizens of the town know what CPA is doing. You know, what is their money being spent on? And so a lot of communities do use their administrative budget for signs, if the signs, you know, are not just a gigantic list of rules, you know, don't litter, no dawn or dusk, you know, if they're mainly to say, you know, this project paid for with funding from the Community Preservation Act and other funding sources, you know, park open dawn to dusk, that's okay, because your job as a CPC is to keep the citizens informed on what's happening with CPA and what their money's going to. So I think signs are the one area where you're probably safe. But any other expenses, really, if they come up afterwards, and that happens all the time, you know, either the town has to come up with the money from another funding source, or the CPC recommends to go back to
It
town
happened
meeting.
recently, the town manager came to me and wanted money for legal things that had to do with something that we purchased 2 years ago.
Right.
And I said,
No.
tough
that's-
bananas. you
It's
know.
town land now. Yeah, it's town land now. I mean, when I was chair of my CPC, which was a long time ago, we were building a tennis court, brand new tennis court, and we got an appropriation from town meeting. And that summer was one of those summers where the Saudis cut, or OPEC cut the oil production dramatically, and the price of gas went nuts. And all the expense in a tennis court is that, 8 inches of asphalt they put down there, which is oil-based, and the price of asphalt skyrocketed that summer. And so by the time the project was bid in the fall and they were ready to do it before the winter, there wasn't even close to being enough money. So, I had to go back in front of town meeting next year with my tail between my legs and say, we need another $40,000 to do this tennis court. And it got delayed for a year, and, town meeting threw darts at you, but it happens. You probably have seen it before happen at your town meeting on non-CPA issues. So,
And for things that are for your committee that are of that maximum 5%, there, we do not have to budget that. Like I think, made a mistake of putting on a warrant for our plan. We were gonna update our plan and found out, no, you don't
that's right.
do a warrant article. It just comes out of your budget.
Yeah, and you can rapidly see why, right? I mean, you put $3,000 aside for your plan, and let's say you want to use an outside person to do some research for that plan, and it ends up being $3,800. What are you going to do? So it is almost all communities. There are 1 or 2 cities where the city council makes them break down that administrative budget into tiny little pieces, which really makes it very difficult. But in general, you just say, we're gonna appropriate, $10,250 for administrative expenses. Town meeting votes that, now it's an appropriation that is available for your committee to spend by a majority vote at your meeting. So you can break it up any way you want. All right, so these are, I call these like the 5 basic tenets of CPA. They're unrelated, but they're sort of the 5 things that are sort of ironclad rules with CPA that are always good to keep in everyone's, back of everyone's mind. The first is there is a clause in CPA called the no supplanting clause. It's in the last line of section 6. And what it basically says is if something is in the town's budget, or if town meeting has already voted to appropriate money for a project, you can't then switch that funding source later to CPA. CPA is a voluntary tax on top of your regular tax base. It's for new things, buying new land, building new parks, doing top to bottom rehabs of historic buildings. There's never money for that in a budget. So it's for things over and above the budget. It's not designed to backfill things that are already in the budget or that the town typically pays for out of its regular budget. It wasn't designed to give relief to the regular budget. It was for new things. It certainly does give relief in the way that, if you wanted to build a park before, you had to go do a Prop 2.5 override, and now you can use CPA. So it certainly does give relief to the taxpayers of taking some things that you might have spent, but not out of the regular budget, not regular typical things. So this was actually put in there for one of the main things I think they were trying to avoid, according to DOR anyways, is you buy a piece of open space 5 years before you have CPA, and it's a 20-year bond. And then in year 6, you adopt CPA. And someone says, we owe $75,000 in debt service for that open space this year. Now we have CPA, that's for open space. Let's pay the rest of it out of CPA. And you can't do that because the original funding source did not mention CPA. It mentioned another account, and you can't then switch that to CPA. If you could have done that, you could see you probably would end up with nothing left to spend on CPA because the town would find a way to spend all that other money to free up, money for the roads or the schools or whatever. So that's a real important part to remember on CPA. CPA can never be used for maintenance or regular operating expenses. So it's great that you can build a new park for the town, but the town has to then take care of that park, and that's a consideration that should be made. CPA can buy the land and build the capital expenses to build assets, but then, you know, the historic town hall that you so lovingly restored with CPA funds, now the regular budget has to maintain that building and keep it up. In the recreation category, we constantly get asked about indoor recreation projects, and CPA is for outdoor recreation only. Recreation is actually in the definition section of CPA, part of the definition of open space. You know, fields, forests, farms, wetlands, beachfront, ponds, streams, and land for recreational use. So parks, playgrounds, athletic fields, DOR calls it land in as close as possible to its natural state. It's not for, it actually specifically says gymnasiums, it says horse or dog racing tracks for some reason, stadiums, gymnasiums, or similar structures. So it's really for anything that is land-based outside recreation.
Quick question on that.
Yeah.
If someone was to want to use CPA funds for like a park, but have like a 3-season building to use for like picnic type stuff in there, you know,
That's
or
fine.
probably, you know, with that,
Yeah, as
it
long
has to
as,
be like a building-ish thing. 'Cause,
like a gazebo or a pavilion,
yeah,
something
like
like that.
even something that would be like roofed and maybe even have like bug screening on the whole thing, that kind of.
That's fine. You know, it's something that's typically found in a park. I call it park-like amenities. So benches, hardscape, walkways, lights, a storage shed, a gazebo, a picnic pavilion, a modest bathroom, not with offices or changing rooms or something like that, but just a bathroom.
Security
Those are all
cameras.
things. What's that?
Security cameras.
Yeah, I mean, those are all things that are typically found in a park. You know, it does say no stadiums, gymnasiums, or similar structures. So if you wanted to build something that was truly massive, you know, and had hard walls and doors, you know, I think you'd be pushing it there. But, you know, a gazebo, a screened-in gazebo, a screened-in picnic pavilion, I think that's very typically found in a park.
How about midway as you're talking about restrooms? We have a situation that's going to be coming up where someone is going to be looking to get a field built, all right, a recreation field. They have an existing structure, and what they'd like to do is to renovate a portion of that structure to have restrooms available for the folks that are using the field.
Okay, so what's there now? There's a field there now?
There's land.
There's land, okay. Open land that they want to make into a more formal field.
There
No,
is
there's
a field, there's a
There's a
soccer
field,
field.
there's a soccer field.
Right,
This
soccer
is that,
fields.
I don't know if you remember, Stuart, the Lions Club property I had talked to you about, where they have an existing building with a bathroom, but they wanted to renovate that bathroom. What we talked about was basically creating a new bathroom that could be attached to that building, but access to the bathroom would be from the outside.
Yeah, that sounds fine to me.
The only issue with that is there's currently a cesspool. The whole septic will have to be redone. And they're looking to CPC, I think, for that funding.
So what's the building? What is the building used for?
It's,
Like an office kind of thing. Yeah?
it's like the Lions Club offices.
Okay.
They hold meetings there. They allow the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts to meet in there.
Yeah.
But they have, like, all their files are there. I
Yeah.
mean, it actually has like a fireplace. I
I think they call it their clubhouse.
yeah, because like they even let the scouts camp in there like in the winter. I
Is it-
remember.
It's still
Is it
pretty
a-
small.
Is it a historic building?
No.
Okay, okay. Is there a bathroom inside?
Yes.
One
Okay,
right.
So you're gonna put another bathroom accessible for the fields when the building's locked, people will be able to use it from the outside.
Yes.
But they have to do one septic system that's going to handle all the bathrooms.
That they haven't figured out yet. They may keep the cesspool for just the bathroom and the kitchen that's in that building.
But that doesn't make any real sense.
Yeah,
I
and,
know.
and I bet you your Board of Health will not allow that.
Right.
I mean, I know our Board of Health would never allow two different septic systems
right.
on one parcel.
Right.
One,
So then-
one is archaic.
Right.
Yeah.
So they'd have to put in a new one
It's,
that would then
it's a
service
good
both.
opportunity to upgrade it anyways, just
Yeah.
for the, for the future. You're gonna end up having to do something with that cesspool at some point, probably.
Right.
So I'd say in that situation, you would be able to pay for 100% of the bathroom construction.
Yep.
And then you would have to find some way to apportion the cost of the
Okay.
septic system. So, you could do a gallons estimate. you know,
Yeah.
CPA calls that the proportionate use concept. That
Okay.
CPA can pay for the proportionate use that a CPA asset's going to have. It seems like if you've got, 2 bathrooms inside and 2 bathrooms outside,
And one is
50-50
used,
sounds
one is
great.
used by, legions of soccer people.
Right, and
And
the
one
other-
is used by a few people once in a while.
Right.
yeah.
If I remember correctly, isn't the one inside still currently used by people that use the fields? And because they don't
No,
have any
they've
others?
stopped, they bring a porta potty on.
Okay.
Onto the field
It's
because
not
they were letting
sufficient.
people go in and it was too much for
It's
the
being
system.
overused.
Was
Too
being
much for the,
overused.
That's
for the
what I was-
cesspool.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So you just find some reasonable way to apportion that, based on estimated use, 50-50, if this, it probably will get, it'll get a lot more use on the outside, but then it'll get nothing all winter long, so it might
Right.
semi-balance out. To tell you the truth, having both of those tie into one septic system will be actually healthier for the septic system, because if there's really low flow on that building, septic
Right.
systems don't work very well if they don't get regular use.
Yeah.
And on the field, on the other side, nothing will be used all winter, but the building will still have stuff going on. So that's actually
It's symbiotic.
from a,
Yes.
from a proper,
Symbiotic septic system, right?
proper septic system flow.
Yeah.
It's a good thing to keep stuff flowing there year round.
That's right.
Yes.
I have a question about the asset purchases point.
Yes.
There are many kinds of assets. Some of them have a very high value, like land, and some have lower value. Does that mean like all asset purchases, or is there a implied type or purchase amount?
Right, so you're asking about the last one, which says that whenever you buy something with CPA funds, you have to put a permanent restriction on it. So there really are only very few things you can buy with CPA funds. You can buy land for either conservation purposes or recreation purposes. You can buy a historic building if you want to. Usually folks fix up historic buildings with CPA money. They don't usually buy buildings, but we have had some built. You can buy a structure for affordable housing and convert that into housing. You can buy an abandoned factory and convert that into housing. It's real property interest purchases.
Right, so, okay, so, it says you must have a permanent restriction with this, held by a third party.
Right, okay.
So what if you
explain that?
can't find a third party that's
Well,
interested?
that's a very real
Because
scenario.
there aren't that many third parties.
Yeah, so, I mean, typically, the things that we cover in CPA is land with a conservation restriction, whether it's for active recreation, passive recreation, or conservation land, it's all the same, it's a conservation restriction. It's just what you can do on the land is just different wording in the document, but it's all a conservation restriction. And housing restrictions and historic preservation restrictions. Those are the three we normally deal with. And like I said, they're only required when you buy the real property.
So what third parties would be interested in historical restrictions?
Okay, that's a tough one, but you typically don't buy a historic asset. Usually you're fixing up one you already owned. So have you ever
And
purchased?
so that doesn't count necessarily, okay.
It can count,
If you
but you in your two towns, you probably have never bought a historic building.
No,
No, we've
Most-
restored them,
most-
but not.
Most don't. We have had some with CPA, but in most cases, you're fixing up a historic building. Now, that doesn't mean you can't, as a board, decide that you want to make a condition of this project when we're fixing up this historic building to put a preservation restriction on it. Typically, you would do that, not necessarily if you were fixing up town hall. I'm sure you didn't require a preservation restriction.
what we do is we fix up Indian reservation structures
Okay, and were those owned by a private party or are they owned by the
by
town?
the Indians,
Okay.
by the natives.
So typically, in that case, even though a restriction, a historic preservation restriction is not required because you didn't buy them, you just fixed them up, most CPCs would want to find a way to protect their public investment in that private asset. That's a private asset, and you put public money into fixing it up. So typically, you would get the town would get a preservation restriction.
So
done.
they're not a third party though,
That's right. In that case, you would need a third party.
okay. Right, in fact, that's what we do.
That's what we
That's
That's what we do.
Yeah, perfect. And when you're giving money to a private organization, usually it's in the historic category, and usually you do get a restriction back.
So, and so it's not necessary to be a third party.
That's right. So, so the typical third-party transactions are, you buy a piece of open space, the town owns the land, but they have to get someone other than the town to hold the restriction. So the seller is one party, the town buys the fee in the land, and that's the second party, and then a land trust, let's say, would hold the conservation restriction. The reason why the conservation restriction and the fee, or the ownership in the land, have to be two separate parties is something called the common law doctrine of merger. So if the town buys the land, and then typically we'll get the question, oh, the Conservation Commission, they can hold the restriction, right? Well, the job of the person who's holding the restriction is to watch over the owner of the land to make sure they don't do anything nefarious. They don't build a DPW garage there, they don't dump there, neighbors don't encroach on it. They have to watch over the land. If the Conservation Commission, which is a town entity and a town board, were watching over a piece of town land and enforcing a 17-page restriction, which had all sorts of rules and regulations in it, if they saw a violation, what's the Conservation Commission going to do? Most boards and committees can't even access any legal advice without going through the selectmen. Well, the selectmen might have just ordered, there to be built a storage bunker there. How is the town going to enforce itself? The CONSCOM is just a town board without a lot of teeth, frankly, legal teeth. There has to be a third party who's independent, who says to the town, hey, you can't build that little building here. And if the town goes ahead, they might have to sue the town. The CONSCOM is not going to be able to sue the town.
Right, yeah.
So,
And so for most purposes, open space, you can get the land trust to take it. But if the property were purchased for recreation,
that's a real hard one.
Yeah, it could be another hard
frankly,
one.
Historic and recreation are hard. Land is easy. I mean, Rena was just telling me they've had two big open space purchases, and they have two different land trusts, one holding each one, the restriction, which is great. So, but recreation, there hasn't been a lot of land purchased for active recreation, parks, playgrounds, athletic fields. The ones that have, our town actually did one, and we got the local athletic association, the one who runs all the soccer leagues and everything. They're our nonprofit 501c3. They use the fields. It kind of made sense that they were going to watch over the fields, and watch what the town did on those fields to make sure that if the CR said no chemical fertilizer, that would be to that organization's benefit to make sure that the chemical fertilizer wasn't used, because their kids are going to be running on that field. But it is hard. Westport had a real problem finding someone for an active organization, and they finally convinced the Youth Baseball Association to do it. Weymouth, there are really no land trusts in Weymouth, and they bought a piece of open space, a very urban area, and they actually, citizens formed a new organization, a new local land organization to hold that conservation restriction. So it can be difficult. Historic ones, it can't be the Historic Commission, but most towns have like a historic society that often will hold a historic restriction. So, and housing is easy, because housing is the opposite. Usually you're going to own the historic building if you buy it, or you're going to own the land if you buy it. The town is. In housing, it's the opposite. The town usually doesn't own the housing unit. Usually they sell the housing, either to a developer who rents it out, or to individual homeowners for affordable housing. So they own the fee, and the town just keeps the restriction. In housing, it's very simple. Your town property already owns some affordable housing restrictions. You don't even know about it. All right, we skipped one, the historic one. Anytime you use money, not on acquiring historic assets, but on fixing them up, like we just talked about, the work has to follow something called the Secretary of Interior Standards for Historic Preservation. And we have a copy of those rules on our website. They're not nearly as onerous or bad as they sound. They're actually, you think that would have like a gigantic manual that's 700 pages long, like the red tape you'd find in most federal programs. But believe it or not, it fits on one page. It's just 10 very common sense things. Like, if the building has always been white, you don't paint it purple. If the building has always been wood-sided, you don't put hardy plank or plastic on it. If the building has a beautiful historic spiral staircase, you don't take that out because you want to put a kitchen in there. You know, just common sense things about how to properly do work on a historic building. And it's important because, you know, particularly on town buildings, towns usually often want to get the CPA money, but then they want to do whatever they want to the building. You know, they aren't all that interested in the historic nature. They just want to do it as least expensive as possible and to, you know, have the most benefit in terms of square footage and storage and all that sort of thing. And Hamilton right now is having a big row over whether, when they rehab their beautiful historic town hall, whether to take out those classic double staircases when you walk in. You know, you have those beautiful classic double staircases that they used to build. Well, they're really not both necessary, and the building they want to have a handicapped accessible elevator for the second floor. And so one of the proposals is to take out the staircase and put the elevator in there. Other people, to do it properly under the Secretary of Interior standards, you would build a very discrete elevator shaft addition out the back of the building and put the elevator and probably a new fire staircase in there. But they're having a big debate on that. And, you know, the Secretary of Interior standards, because it's not 700 pages of ironclad things, you know, sometimes people interpret them differently. So it's an interesting argument and it's over whether taking out that historic staircase would be in violation of the standards. It is, but not everyone agrees in Hamilton. So the selectmen in particular voted to take out the staircase and put the elevator in there. So we'll see what happens. But that's a typical situation often when an owner of a property, the town or someone else, wants to do something that's in conflict with proper historic standards. That's why you have the extra money of CPA, so you can do it right. So, all right.
When a town does move a project forward violating those standards, what happens? Who goes after them in some way? What's the recourse that does happen?
So the recourse on CPA projects is the same recourse that's available on any town project. When the town doesn't do something right, public pressure often comes to bear to expose the fact that it's not being doing right. If political leaders make those decisions, sometimes it costs them at the ballot next time. But the heaviest thing that can happen is a 10 taxpayer lawsuit. Where if 10 taxpayers disagree with an expenditure of town money, they can sue the town. It just takes 10 people signing away. And we've had 10 taxpayer lawsuits on CPA projects. It's not common. We've had 12,000 projects and we've probably had 6 lawsuits. But we're going to talk about one of those in a second, actually, a 10 taxpayer lawsuit. So, and it was over a historic project. I think it might be the next slide, as a matter of fact. So, the one thing I did want to mention, and kind of preaching to the choir here, because you folks have both bonded for projects, for CPA projects. But it is possible you can borrow against your future CPA revenue stream the same way the town borrows against its regular tax revenue stream to build roads and schools and things like that. You can borrow against the future CPA revenue stream to buy a big piece of open space or to fix up a historic town hall from top to bottom. And it's pretty popular. We have close to 100 communities that have bonded that, and many have bonded more than once. You can see there's 89 communities, but 237 projects. I know our community has bonded 4 times for CPA projects. There's over $300 million in outstanding bonds that were paid with CPA funds. And like I said, the most popular thing you would bond for is to buy open space or recreation land, top to bottom historic rehab of a building, and building a brand new huge recreational facility. Those are sort of the typical ones you'd see get bonded. All right, so this is the last complicated thing I have for you, and actually the lawsuit is next with one more slide. This look familiar to anyone, this chart here?
Yeah.
This is the CPA allowable uses chart. It is the single most important piece of paper in the CPA world. It really is where the conversation should start anytime someone says to you, either informally or formally here at a CPA meeting, can we use CPA funds to blank, 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 blank? Really, the chart should be, that's the point at which you stop and you take out the chart. Because every project, you want to find the proper box on that chart that you can stuff that project into, the budget for that project. If you can't find a box on that chart that says yes, then you can't do it with CPA funds. So let's see how that works. You know, people know the 4 categories of CPA. That's pretty obvious. But most folks end there. So they think if they have a great open space project, something to do with history, something to do with recreation, or something to do with housing, that it can qualify for CPA funding. But what they don't know is there's these 5 verbs along the left side of the chart, and these limit what you can do in each of those categories. So let's pick a historic project, for example. Someone comes in with an application, and they want to do an oral history of World War II veterans. There's only 16 World War II veterans left in town. And we want to hire a professional video crew and record their stories, their historic stories, show their historic artifacts, so we can get that all in a beautiful, video of the World War II history in our town. So they ask, is that eligible for CPA funding? So you go to the chart. In the historic category, you have 3 verbs that can justify a project. You have to be acquiring a historic resource. And there's a definition in section 2 of a historic resource. It's a building, structure, vessel, meaning a boat, real property, document, or artifact. Those are the 6 things you can buy with CPA funds. So making an oral history doesn't qualify, right? You can preserve a historic resource. Preserve has a definition in section 2. It's protecting the asset from injury, harm, or destruction. So you can protect a historic building, structure, vessel, real property, document, or artifact from harm. Putting a sprinkler system in a historic building, or putting a new roof on because it's leaking and harming the building. Oral history, is that preserving one of those 6?
No.
No.
Nope. It's preserving the memories, but building, structure, vessel, real property, document, or artifact are the only historic resources that can be preserved under CPA. And you're obviously not rehabilitating or doing physical work to fix up a building, structure, vessel, real property, or document, or artifact. So that is not eligible for CPA funding. So that's kind of how you step through the chart. And when you are doing something, you want to find the verb and say, yep, with this project, we've been asked to provide money to Habitat for Humanity to help them build a unit of affordable housing. Well, we're not going to own that, so we're not acquiring anything. But are we creating a unit of affordable housing by giving that money? Yes. So you point to that box, and it's even good to, in your motion, when you appropriate the money, it's even good to mention to show that you have proven that it's eligible for funding. So I move that we support Habitat for Humanity by appropriating $50,000 from the Housing Reserve account to create an affordable housing unit in Grafton on Johnson Street, something like that. That would be the motion at your meeting. And then you've sort of proven that the committee has thoughtfully made sure that that's an okay expenditure, and you've justified it by finding the home on that chart. Sometimes you need more than one box. That's why it's important to have the actual budget. When people apply for projects, you really should have them hand in a detailed budget. And find, sometimes you need 2 boxes or 3 boxes to justify different pieces of that budget. If you're going to buy a piece of land and build a park on it, well, the budget includes money to acquire recreation land and then to create the park on that land or create the baseball field. So you actually need 2 boxes on that chart to justify that project. So that's how you use the allowable uses chart.
What is the definition of support?
Support did not have a definition at all. So it's whatever your committee considered to be support of affordable housing. In 2012, that big piece of legislation added a definition of support. And the reason it did was that a lot of communities were appropriating money under the support box for things that were not developing permanent affordable housing. Things like rental assistance for low-income homeowners, first-time buyers, down payment assistance, things that were helping individuals, not necessarily building a unit. And most town councils said, yeah, that's supportive of affordable housing, but a few of them disagreed, and that became a problem. So the legislature added a definition of support. And the definition says, support shall include, but not be limited to, payments on things like down payment assistance, mortgage, first mortgage assistance, home buyers assistance, all that sort of thing. So it didn't touch anything about what communities were using that verb for before, because it says it shall include this thing that we're talking about now, but it can include whatever else it normally included. So it was specifically left vague so that you folks can determine what it is, because the reason that verb is only available in the housing category, and the reason why it didn't even have a definition, and the definition now does not limit it in any way, it just sort of enforces that you can use it for those down payment assistance things and rental assistance. The reason was the legislature really knew this was going to be the hardest category. What's been the hardest category?
That is the hardest.
What's been the hardest category in Grafton to figure out? Housing? You shaking your head?
Well, we haven't done enough with housing.
Yeah, so it's hard.
Very
Yes.
little, it is.
Yeah.
It's hard.
Right.
And so they wanted to give you every tool in the toolbox. If you want to hire a housing coordinator to try, 20 hours a week to try to get something going in housing, that's supportive of affordable housing. If you want to do
Doing the housing plan is
Yep.
support.
You want to do a housing plan. You want to go do a perk test on the open land, behind town hall that's just sitting there because maybe you would be able to build a duplex back there and you want to perk it to see if it perks. That's supportive of affordable housing. They really deliberately wanted to give you an area in that category because there are literally 1,000 things to spend money on before a shovel ever goes in the ground on housing. Developers like to joke that 2/3 of their money is spent before a shovel even goes in the ground.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Housing. So, all right. So I think this may be the last thing coming up.
Abigail Adams house?
Yeah, very
Oh,
good.
wow.
Holy cow! How do you know that?
I saw it on your site.
Oh, okay. So, last Friday, I spoke at the Statewide Historic Preservation Conference, and after my session, a woman who couldn't have been more than 3.5 feet tall comes up and walks up very gingerly with her cane and says, "I want to meet you because I am the president of the Abigail Adams Society, and I see that our building all over your website and in our presentations, and I use it all the time because it's this building was." And I asked her, she's going to send me a before picture. This is the after picture.
Beautiful.
The before picture there was graffiti all over this place. It was just in terrible shape, and the little old lady hadn't been able to figure out how to rehab the Abigail Adams house because it was expensive, and they had a small volunteer, very elderly group that was running that association, and they just didn't have the capacity. And CPA came to the rescue, and it's just spectacular now. And it's such a important historic resource, not just for the towns around there, but really for the whole country. So very good. That's the first time that's ever happened. So in doing a project like that, the problem is, as we talked about, you're not giving money to a public organization. You're using public money to support a private organization. And we have something in Massachusetts called the Anti-Aid Amendment. It's not even a law. It's an amendment to our state's constitution. So it can't even be changed by a law. It's actually part of our constitution in the mid-1800s. And what it basically says is you can't give public money to a private organization. That's really what it says. And it was designed back then when the Irish Catholic were flooding into the country, and the folks who were here wanted to keep the Irish Catholic uneducated and in manual labor jobs, and they didn't want any public money going to support Irish Catholic parochial schools. That's why the law was passed. So it was really a very discriminatory law, but here it is, still in our books, 150 years later, and it is really impossible to change because it requires a constitutional amendment for the Commonwealth. But luckily, it has been interpreted through case law, because it's been around for 150 years, to say you can't give public money to a private organization for their private use. But you can give public money to a private organization to benefit the public. So, this building, for example, is open to the public all the time. It's a huge part of our country's history. It's an important building that clearly has public benefit, even though it's run by a private organization. So that's how the steps you have to go through when you think about giving public money to private institutions. You really have to think through what is the public benefit of this appropriation. And in fact, if you got an application to do what they did here, to fix up the whole exterior and even do some interior work, that's fine. If they had gotten an application just to put, cushy wood paneling in the office that is off limits to the public, and new carpeting and that really wouldn't be, even though it's a beautiful building that benefits the public, that expenditure would not be beneficial to the public in any way. I mean, it's a section of the museum that's off limits to the public. So, you got to be careful about that's the one thing to think through, the projects to really think through, or when you're asked for public money on a private organization. It is a huge part of CPA, so don't be afraid to do it, but you really want to make sure you have a real robust discussion of what the public benefit is. And your go-to, if you're trying to find public benefit, is to get a preservation restriction back if it's a historic building. That is the ultimate public benefit, because when the town owns a historic preservation restriction on a private building, the town actually owns a piece of that building. It's an asset of the town. That restriction is enforceable by the town. It's an asset of the town. It has value to the town, and it keeps that building looking like it was supposed to forever, because you put money in to fix it up to make it look like that. So you're protecting the public's investment by having that restriction on the building. So that is the ultimate public benefit. But there are other ways too. Buildings like this that are, long established museums that are open to the public, and I think that residents of that particular town, it's either Weymouth, I think it's Weymouth, get in free, things like that are also public benefit as well. You don't always have to have the restriction.
What about the problem with funding churches, like Mass Historical and that church?
You read my mind, John. Uncanny. 10 taxpayer lawsuits. So I said this is a big part of CPA, right? And so up until 2016, a big part of CPA was not just, secular buildings like the Abigail Adams House, but a big part of CPA was fixing up iconic, very historic religious institutions. What is the most iconic view of a New England town green? It's the
Big
church and
white
the green.
church.
And before 1846, I think, church and state were the same. So the church was the town offices up until the separation of church and state. So, we had where was the church that just came up? I forgot what town it was, but there's a plaque on the church that says this was the site of the first 50 town meetings in the history of our town. It was also the site of, where the
Elections were.
yeah, and all the whatever war was happening then, that's where they mustered in that building. And it's even in the deed that if that church ever goes out of business, the building reverts back to the town. But still, it's a private ownership, and it's an active religious institution. But in the first 300 grants that CPA Communities gave across the Commonwealth, really following what Mass Historic Commission has done for 25 years in terms of their grants, they gave grants to historic religious institutions. The thinking was these are historic buildings. It doesn't matter what goes on in the building. We don't ask, what happens in a historic building. It's the building itself that we're preserving, not the use of the building, but the building itself. But it does bring up a lot of passion on both sides of the issue of separation in church and state. And in 2016, 10 taxpayers did get together and sued the town of Acton for an appropriation they did to the church that's pictured here, actually two churches, one of them withdrew their application immediately, to do a master plan of the property and also to do some stained glass work on their beautiful historic stained glass windows that are visible from the outside and the inside. And there's an organization that sort of watches these issues nationally. It's called Americans United for Separation of Church and State. And they are really the ones who was behind it. They actually found 10 people in Acton who were willing to put their name on the lawsuit. But it was the organization that did it.
Because
and
they called Grafton.
everyone.
And they called,
I called
talked to
everyone,
me.
yeah.
Yes, they
We didn't
called
have any.
every single town and put a public records request in to ask for all the records on all the appropriations you had done for churches, and then they looked through them all and picked the one that they thought was the most ripe for a lawsuit. And they picked very well, because it turns out this is not the typical project. A master plan and stained glass windows with religious imagery are not the typical CPA grant. Usually it's the exterior siding, the steeple, the clock, the front stairs, things that really make the building look great from the public's view on the town green. But the organization was very smart in picking this one, because the windows had tremendous religious imagery, and some people aren't comfortable with that, with spending their money on that direct religious imagery. And so the basis of the lawsuit hinged on that, which really is not the typical CPA project. So it's unfortunate, but that's why they picked it.
So what's the
What happened?
Yeah, so I thought I'd put in another slide with what happened, but I did that on my webinar, not on here. Okay, so the case, long story made short, went all the way to the Supreme Judicial Court. The only time CPA is in front of the SJC in Massachusetts. And the ruling was not as nearly as clear as we would have liked it. But basically what the court said was the case law on the anti-aid amendment. Remember I said there's been case law on the anti-aid amendment? One of them was a case from Springfield called Helms, where people sued because they were providing public money to buy textbooks for secular schools. And in that case, whenever it was, the 1930s, the SJC said, well, here's a 3-part test you have to make and go through to determine whether this grant is okay or not. And so basically they said you have to apply the 3-part test from Helms to any appropriation of CPA money. And the test is not easy. It's complicated, and it's legalese filled, and it's not something that a CPC would do on their own without legal counsel. But basically the test tries to determine, is there a hidden purpose to your organization, your board, in trying to help this church organization, like trying to get money to them because they're in trouble? That would disqualify it. Does giving them money, even if there's no hidden purpose, but does it in some way aid the church in their operation? That's almost always going to be true, right? If you're providing money to a religious organization to help fix up their building, that is giving them money to spend on other things. So that piece of the test is almost always going to be true. And the third part of the test is, will the appropriation of money bring about public discourse? Will it, generate controversy? Will it, it used a very gentlemanly way to describe it from the 1800s. Will it upset the balance of public discourse or cause, people to get upset? And, anytime you do a church appropriation, you're not going to get a unanimous vote at town meeting. When these have come up, even though we had 300 successful passages of them, they almost all had debates at town meeting, and there were people that were passionate on both sides of the issue. So the court set the bar very high. They really did. And as a matter of fact, the lawyer for Acton said, I fear that their decision, even though it's not ironclad, is going to put a chilling effect on these type of projects.
so you have to pass each step?
No. So that's the thing that's really complicated. There's some legal terminology about the balancing of all things, that they all have to be taken into consideration as a whole. So just because you fail the second test, you know, if you overwhelmingly pass the third test and you're kind of break even on the first test, it might be okay. You have to balance all of those and make it, yeah, it's really subjective. So that's another reason why the test is so hard, is it's not you have to pass all three or you fail, or, you know, or if you fail 2 out of the 3, you fail. You know, it's not that clear.
And that's a
so-
CPA,
what happened?
not Mass Historical. They haven't gone after Mass Historical.
They did not. Isn't that interesting?
Because Mass Historical, I would say, has given out a lot more money.
Actually, in dollar amounts, no. Their grants are actually much
Smaller, but
Yeah.
in terms of numbers of
They've been
projects.
doing it for 25 years and numbers of
Because
projects.
Grafton did get one
ton.
from Mass Historical.
A ton. So I think they probably didn't go after the state of Massachusetts because they have, you know, 300 attorneys at the Attorney General's office who, you know, I think they figured they'd have a lot more success against a little small town like Acton.
Poor Acton.
You know how
So-
much money Acton spent on this?
250,000.
Yeah, how'd you know?
How much?
Good guess, sir.
$250,000 on this lawsuit.
And they, so what happened with it?
Well, the projects didn't go forward.
Oh, okay.
You know,
And the grant was for how much?
$80,000. But Acton, you know, Acton is a town that does everything right. You know, initially when they picked Acton, you know, I thought either they started at the alphabet, and Acton is the first town. Actually, Abington. We have Abington now, but it's a recent town. Acton, for years, was the first town in the. So they just went to the top of the alphabet, and I was so happy they picked Acton because Acton does everything right. I mean, they were so careful. They've done these projects before. They always get a preservation restriction in return, and as a matter of fact, they go even to the extra step of they don't give the church a penny until the whole project is done, they've inspected it, and the preservation restriction is written, approved at the state, and filed at the registry. Then they get their money. No one,
Write that down.
no one goes to that extent because, you know, if you're giving them a new roof and it's leaking, you know, they got to put that roof on now. You know, it could take 2 years to get the restriction. But Acton does everything right. They have a tremendous town council. And so I was really excited when they sued Acton, but it turns out they picked the project, not the town. And that application had a line in it that where the church said, if we don't, you know, if we have to do this work on our building, we will not have enough money to advance our religious, you know, intent of the organization. Which is probably true in all cases, but they put it right there in the application, and that, you know, that leapt off the page, you know, with the lawyers in DC at Americans United. And then they also looked at what the project was, which was these stained glass windows that had heavy religious imagery, which makes some people uncomfortable. You know, I can see that. So in the end, they picked very well in terms of advancing their cause. The funny thing is that we've had, and I just did this presentation at the conference. This is what I was doing the presentation on at the conference, and we went through our database and tried to figure out what have towns done since, and it is all over the road. But we've had far more that have gone ahead with these than have stopped doing them. And there is a reason to at least consider them. And this is the last point I'll leave you with, because this is going to just make you run for the exits. This is a damned if you do, damned if you don't. At the same time that the SGC was, you know, saying, you know, these are going to be hard to do in the future, you know, and you better be careful. It says, you know, I think their end thing in the case was, you know, they deserve careful scrutiny. You know, as we're going in that direction in Massachusetts, the federal Supreme Court is going in the opposite direction. And there was a case in Missouri where a church applied for a public state grant program that fixes up playgrounds at schools. And so a church applied for their playground they have for their parochial school. And the state said, no, we only give grants to secular schools. We don't do any religious playgrounds. And they sued under the federal discrimination clause, saying you're discriminating against us purely because we're a religious organization. And they won. So, put that in this context, if you tell a church, nope, we're not doing any more religious buildings,
So, yeah.
we're not helping any religious organizations in town, they could sue you under the discrimination clause. If you go ahead and do the project, Americans United might find 10 very willing people in Grafton or Upton to sue you. So, that's where I end. No, I have a recommendation. Because that's a scary prospect. And so what we're recommending to folks, and actually it was good that we had this session because there are a lot of lawyers there and they all agreed this is probably the best thing that you can do is you accept any application that comes to you. Do not make any sort of blanket, disallowance of any religious institutions. You accept the application and you forward it to your town council and you say, please apply the Helms test from the SJC decision and let us know whether this application is eligible for funding. And let town council go through that test and send you a note back saying, yes, we feel it passes the test, and then you guys can debate the merits of the project just like any other project in that cycle. If they say no, we feel it fails the test, you send a little note to the church and with a copy of the lawyer's piece. And so that way you really have adhered to both the federal and the state standard in doing that. So have either of you done projects like this in the past? You said you had?
Grafton got money from Mass Historical.
Oh, okay, you didn't do any
For
CPA
church,
money
no.
in that project?
They did approach us. They wanted us to pave a parking lot, which wasn't,
It's not a great CPA project.
but it benefited the town, it was great for the common, but it wasn't, so we
Not really historic preservation.
didn't encourage that, so.
And have you done any in Upton? No. It's pretty common. I mean, it's actually, you're in the minority of towns. Most towns, more than not, have done these sort of
Well,
projects
we're
in the past.
probably gonna, I'm sure there's gonna be some issue. We've got an old church, but it's no longer a religious church.
Oh, well, then you're fine.
So-
Then you're fine. It's the fact that it's used actively for religion that's the problem. Because the SJC actually said in their case, we can see examples of where a church is no longer used for religious purposes, or the church owns other buildings that aren't used for religious purposes. We could see those being purely historic assets and not have a problem. So there are a lot of former churches that are many other things. Concert halls are owned by friends organizations or that sort of thing, or towns, and those should be okay. I'd watch if there's still any stained glass windows in there that.
The stained glass windows are all gone.
Okay, all right.
They did take them out.
Where are they?
I don't know what
Gone?
I think they sold them. I'm not sure what. No, well, interestingly enough, no, they moved them. They built a new church, and they took all of the stained windows from the old church and moved it to the new
Put
church.
regular glass there. Yeah. So that's pretty much what I have for you. Hopefully that was helpful, and I'm happy to hang around and answer any other questions you have. How are we doing on time? Is it right about 9?
It's
9
right,
o'clock.
it's 9 o'clock.
Oh, look at that. I wasn't even looking at the clock and we got it right. But I'm happy to stick around if you have any other questions you want to ask. But we did promise everyone we'd end at 9, so.
You folks have been a great resource for us as we've grown since the time the CPA was passed in Grafton. But it's been wonderful to know that we could go to the coalition. I use the term "we" incredibly loosely, that we send Joanne to the coalition. But the guidance that we've had has given us more answers to questions that we really didn't know which way to go. So thank you very much for all you.
Appreciate that.
I support that heartily. 'cause
Thank you.
We've been to you for many,
One
many
question
times.
It's a
I
labor of love.
do have,
Yes.
are there attorneys that specialize in CPA type?
Not really. There are, it depends upon what type of project. There are attorneys that specialize in land use. So if you're talking about buying a complicated piece of conservation land or a complicated piece of land, for any purposes actually, there are definitely attorneys who specialize in that. There are probably a few attorneys that specialize in historic preservation restrictions, and certainly there are consultants that specialize in how to properly fix up historic buildings, but CPA in general.
More in terms of, these are our warrant articles. Do these meet muster?
And you don't feel town council has that expertise in your particular community?
Well, we're finding out that we're having some problems.
Right. So the problem with that is that you probably, as a board or committee, according to your town bylaws, do not have the right to hire outside counsel.
Well, I think part of it is I don't know that we ever asked town council to review the warrant articles.
Don't they ordinarily?
We were making an
They're
assumption.
See, that's,
You
we
every-
made that operating assumption.
Okay, so that's an incorrect assumption. So
Yeah.
usually, town council does look at all the warrant articles, but they are looking at them for format, for legal errors in the drafting of the thing. They're not examining all the legalities of the underlying project. So, you know, if there's a warrant article to affordable housing, they're not digging into the zoning law to see if that, you know, housing development is legal, you know, is it a DNR lot, does it have the proper frontage? They're not doing that. They do review, and that's a common misconception. People think, well, town council looks over everything in the warrant. They do. They look over the article and things that are in the article. Does it cite the proper law? You know, is there a case law that allows the appropriation to do this? Does it interfere with any of the town bylaws, you know?
Yeah.
Though, is it worded properly? Does it have all the proper citations it needs to? That's what town council does. Unless you specifically send them the article and saying, we want you to examine this for legality under the Community Preservation Act and make sure there's something on that chart that fits and that we've complied with all the other rules. That would have to be a special request that you make,
Yeah, we have done that in the past.
which a lot of communities do. But normally, you're pretty much stuck with town council on that because towns don't like to use other lawyers, because if that lawyer makes a determination and it turns out to be wrong, or maybe it's right but the town still gets sued anyways, now town council has to defend a legal decision made by an outside counsel. You know, you don't want to go back to that town council, you know, that council to defend the town. He might not be an expert in municipal litigation. So most towns are very reluctant to hire outside counsel unless it's something really specialized, because town council is the one that's going to have to defend it if it's a problem. So you might want to try that first, is specifically taking your warrant
If we have
articles.
questions about certain articles, to say, please go over this a little more.
Yep.
we have one
And
that's
that's
coming up.
something that it would be fair to use your administrative account for, because towns are usually very stressed. Their legal budgets are almost always over budget. And so there's no reason why, if that's something you want to know as a CPC, that you should make the town pay for that, even though town council is the one doing the work. You know, when do you have an outside town council probably? Yeah. When they itemize their bill every month and they charge, you know, this work to the school department, so that gets charged to the school department budget, this work to the, you know, DPW budget or whatever, you would just, you know, tell the selectmen you expect that you're gonna pay for it, and town council should itemize it and then just tell you how much it was.
But isn't that contrary to what you said earlier
Which is,
about the portion of the administrative fund that can't go for an expense that is inherently one of the
no,
town?
because you're asking the question. The CPC wants to know the legal answer.
And it's up front. It's before.
But if the town were to turn around and say, we want to get a determination by council,
That's on them.
then it's on them. So
Right,
it's
so-
only if we make the request.
Right.
So if they make the request and then come to us and say, we want you to fund it, we say no.
Yeah, because, I mean, that's not fair, right? They might have run up a huge bill and you didn't even know they asked the question.
Right.
That's not right. They can't come to you afterwards and ask you to pay for that. And that happens a lot, you know? I mean, a lot of times, I'd like to say that all town boards always get along. Or all, you know,
Yeah.
all town boards always get along with the selectmen.
Yeah.
They always do. Oh.
Yeah. Wait a minute, a pig just flew by the window.
So a lot of times, someone out there, you know, has eyes on your money, but you don't know it yet.
Yeah.
They're checking something out legally, so when they come to you, they've got the law already figured out, you know? And that happens a lot, you know? So that's not fair to charge you for that. I mean, that's on them. They went to town council and asked a question it's about CPA, but they wanted to know the answer. Something that they were bothered about.
But there's got to be a fine line there if we have a question
It's a
about, we
nuance.
want to make sure that we're good in what we're bringing to the town meeting, without actually saying, you know, we want to have an increased presence of town council reviewing this warrant article, you know what I mean? And we may think it's routine, or it should be routine, and the town administrator would say, no, that's not, so we want you to fund it. So, you know, it's not really straight-laced here.
It is a nuance, you're right. But I would suggest that if you're interested in something, you usually don't spend your whole administrative budget. I think this is a case of where you really should volunteer to have that charged to you.
Yeah.
If that's something you really want to really double check and cross your Ts and dot your Is, I think it's worth it, number one. And number two, you know, I think that's what your administrative account is for, even though it's town council. But just don't wait till the last minute, because then if you get back, it's a problem. You don't want to hear that 2 weeks before town meeting.
Yeah.
You know? You want to hear that before the warrant closes, so that you can pull something off the warrant. It's always embarrassing when it's already printed, and then you find out there's a problem. You have to stand up at town meeting and pass over it and explain why. So, you know, do that early in the process, which is why one thing that I always recommend is a lot of CPCs don't spend enough time, don't allow themselves enough time for proper due diligence. You know, they take their applications in late December or January and they expect they're only gonna play with them for a month and then send them off to town meeting. You know, it takes, I don't know what your cycle is like, but it can take a while to figure these things out, especially if you do
Yeah.
wanna go to legal counsel. You know,
Ours is pretty tight. We have a public hearing in, applications are due July, public hearing August. Beginning of September, warrant articles are due, town meeting is the third Monday in October.
oh, so you do your projects in the fall.
And
do 'em
then
twice.
we also do them in the
Twice,
spring.
yeah.
Oh,
Same thing.
God bless you.
So, and that's something I've proposed, we'll see, that we do them once a year.
Most do. Northampton started out, they were so excited to have CPA, they said, we're gonna have 4 rounds of funding a year. And they weren't even done, you know, vetting round 1 before the applications flooded in for round 2. And they were just sending round 1 to the city council when the applications came in for round 3, and they hadn't even looked at round 2 yet. They're down to 1
Yeah.
funding round a year. What most folks do is they have 1 round a year, and then they tell folks, for emergencies, we will consider something if it's submitted to us by June 15th for the fall town meeting, if it's of an emergency nature. And by a vote of the CPC, they can decide whether they want to accept that application or kick it to the following town meeting. You might
'Cause I
want
just think it gives us more time
Yeah.
to process
Yeah,
it,
that's
deal
a-
with it, and like you said, vet it.
that's a tight timetable, and it's over the summer when no one really
Right,
wants to work.
right. Well, then nobody's,
You're volunteers and
Nobody's home.
everyone's on vacation, and you want to get an answer to something, and you send it to town council, but they're on vacation, and then by the time they get back to you, you're on vacation, and then you can't get a quorum to a meeting because everyone's gone. That's a tough time to be finalizing your projects. You know, if you did, I would, back that up into May or something like that to start earlier, so you could get a good chunk of that work done before people scoot for the summer, or go to 1 a year. So that's pretty rare to have 2 now. So, yeah.
I have kind of a complicated issue. It's on the October semi-annual town meeting warrant that's coming up in Grafton. There's a capital improvement planning committee that's documenting its bylaw. And it seems that the bylaw establishes that they have some purview over all land purchases, including open space and recreation purchases, that this committee might purchase at some point. And so my question is, given that the act itself specifies exactly how projects get approved, does you know, is it possible for a capital planning committee be able to insert itself into the decision process of CPA purchases?
Yes. I mean, if this passes, you would have to adhere to this. This would trump CPA because it still would require your regular process and a recommendation by the CPC, but the CPA legislation hints at and has an intent that things will go directly to town meeting from you. It says, after receiving such recommendations from the CPC, town meeting shall decide whether they want to make the appropriation. But it doesn't specifically say that it can't travel other normal routes that the town has set up specifically for it. So this is more specific than the CPA legislation, and it doesn't
I see.
narrow the
Okay,
CPA
I understand your
legislation.
answer. However, if you read this article in its carefully, you'll see that it seems to be very unspecific about what it does. So,
Well, I would maybe suggest that someone stand up at town meeting and say,
right, to exclude.
I move to amend section A, definition of capital improvement, to say any acquisition, lease of transfer of land or building with the exception of projects recommended under the Community Preservation Act program.
I think that, yeah,
I mean, if you really can make a strong case that this is gonna, unnecessarily complicate a process that is working very well for you,
that's the point.
Yeah.
The process works very well now, and they add no value.
right? And so I would suggest then just offering an amendment on that.
You go, Ken.
We'll back you up.
And you can do that as an individual at town meeting, or your committee can discuss it and vote on it, and then you would have the ability to say, the CPC, feels unanimously or, voted at their meeting to support this
It
change.
may be better if the committee makes that recommendation.
Remember, we're not in a meeting right now, so we can't
To
make
make a
any
recommendation, we need to have
Anyway,
a
we're discussing,
agenda meeting.
hypotheticals here, so.
But if we wanted to discuss it, we'd have to have a meeting
Yes,
to discuss it,
and vote.
ahead of town meeting.
to
Yeah,
discuss it at town meeting.
Which is a little tight.
the timing's bad now
Well,
because
we may
we're
need
looking
to,
at
we may
next
need to
month.
call a meeting when this one's done.
Yeah.
Well, this is not till October 21st, and this warrant is
Right,
already
we
gone
just have to
ahead.
meet in October.
You could,
We can't call a meeting tonight, it hasn't been posted.
yeah,
Hmm.
It has to
You
have been
could
posted
meet
48
at-
hours at least.
you could meet at 6 o'clock on the 31st and talk about it, and someone comes in with a sketched out amendment and passes it around, and everyone wordsmiths it and then gives it the thumbs up. It would be better to meet ahead of time so that if you were, unanimous in your support, that you could go do a little discussion with other folks ahead of town meeting to explain your position
Or to
rather
get
than,
something in the media.
yeah, just
You wanted
so
to-
not to be a surprise.
So we
But
need to.
this is a little bit, I would consider this to be a little bit of a surprise. I'm sure they didn't come to you and tell you that they were gonna be,
They usually send people to us because they don't wanna pay for it. They think, oh, well, we'll pay for it. And it's
Meaning
usually we
projects,
can't
yeah.
pay for it.
right. But they didn't come and discuss and say, we just
No.
wanna
No,
explain
they
what
did
we're
not.
trying to do here.
No,
We don't wanna get in your way, but we feel this is why this is important or
Yeah.
whatever.
And this is actually a very poorly written bylaw. In fact, I would say that it's horrible, if it's horribly written.
Well, it may crash and burn of its own.
Yeah, I
Horribleness.
think it likely could, if it doesn't really say anything.
It
It
does look-
leaves out a lot of
I've only
important
glanced at it
verbs.
quickly.
They can
but it
make
does
their
look-
own rules. Did you see that in there? There's a line about them making their own rule.
It never says that all capital expenditures have to go through the budget process. It just doesn't.
Have the selectmen voted on, or the finance committee voted on a position on this warrant article yet?
I have not heard.
Not that
I
I've seen.
don't believe finance committee has discussed the warrants.
No,
in
not
full
till
yet.
the 1st of October.
And the
It
selectmen-
also doesn't say that they approve or deny requests. It's
This-
just
yeah.
silent.
The
It
selectmen
doesn't-
has
it doesn't-
signed
it's-
the warrants to appear at town meeting, but beyond that, they haven't. I don't
Anyway.
think we've discussed them.
did the selectmen
Usually-
discuss, did
It's-
they discuss them or they just,
I asked some questions, but again, the vote was to post the warrant, you know, so.
Can
certainly
you
there
come
was-
near a microphone?
Oh,
Here, yeah.
Jen Thomas is a selectman.
hi.
Hi, Jen.
Jen's a member of the CPC.
It did come, the warrant came before the select board, and I did ask questions about it, but we voted to sign the warrant, and again, you know, being that everything, if they're a committee, they can put things on the warrant themselves, you know, so it's not like, you know, we could, you know, if they want it on the warrant, then it's for town meeting to vet and approve and have the discussion, so.
Reminder.
So the selectmen haven't taken a position on it yet?
We have not taken a position. I mean, I've said I was opposed to it individually, but I still signed the warrant because I disagree
And
with
that's
one of the
typically how it
articles.
goes. You just, you don't pull articles out.
We can, but not by another committee. You know, we would typically not take somebody else's article out.
You guys are so polite to each other here. Others. I was in one meeting, and that's the way our town kind of works too, but I was in another town that shall not be named, and, you know, the town manager was in the meeting, and he said, you know, we were talking about a particular project, and he said, oh, no, we'd never allow that on the warrant. And I looked at him, I said, you actually will tell the CPC, no, we're not gonna put that on the warrant? He goes, oh, yeah, we pull warrant articles from committees all the time.
Oh, no, we'd never do that. If
Yeah.
CPC, because the CPC does their own vetting of projects.
That's the way it should be.
and
That's great.
They can put things on the warrant.
But by town meeting, the selectmen probably will stand up and take a position on this, right?
Well, we don't go through every article by article and vote it up or down.
Oh,
Our vote
interesting.
counts the same at town meeting as everybody else.
Yeah.
So I will vote it up or down at town meeting like everybody else.
But sometimes, selectmen will make a
Speak on
statement.
behalf.
Yeah,
At-
yeah.
at a-
And I
at
definitely will
town
be
meeting
speaking at town
about-
meeting against this article.
I mean, you guys could also get on the agenda of the selectmen and express your concerns to them prior to
Yeah.
town meeting as well. As to, and let them know what your plans are at town meeting and why you feel strongly about it and what you're planning to do, and ask for their assistance.
Joanne, can you do that?
Do that.
So we did not schedule a meeting for tonight. Because we knew this would go late, we didn't want to do business afterwards. What we can do is hold a meeting in October, our regular October meeting. It's typically the fourth Thursday
Right, after the town meeting.
after town meeting, but we can call a meeting for maybe the first Thursday. And
But can't we just call, like we do before, don't we schedule a meeting
It'd be better,
prior to town meeting?
it would be
Yeah.
better
But you
to
could
be
also
2 weeks
post a
earlier
meeting
than 2
at
minutes
the select
earlier.
board meeting. We could meet together, so you could, at the next, not Tuesday, cause, well,
not Tuesday,
the agenda won't close till
Today's-
tomorrow afternoon.
right?
But if, you wouldn't have been able to discuss it, but you could post a meeting for like 6:30 and then come in front of the select board at 7. You know, during their regular meeting. I mean, that's possible. Meet
Right.
at the, because that happens all the time. Other committees,
Meet before that meeting, yeah.
yeah, and we have joint meetings with other.
Right.
I mean, we have joint meetings with other committees.
And there's probably a lot of other boards that might be affected by this, and for one board to advance something like this without coming to the other boards and discussing it with
That's
them
grounds
and
for
explaining
rejection
how
right
it would
there.
work, and that is, you know, not a good position to have put other boards in. In my opinion. Oh my. I don't even have a vote at town meeting here in Grafton.
That's a 2/3 vote, right?
Yeah, cause the.
It is.
It is a 2/3 vote, yes.
But it's late in the, late on the warrant.
Yeah.
And there's not much on the warrant.
Right.
It's
So
like
maybe-
24.
Maybe it'll go fast then.
There's not a lot of, there's not a lot of controversial things on the warrant. It's a lot
Yeah.
of just housekeeping.
There's 30 articles and it's
So
24.
that we can let
24.
our guests from Upton go.
Can I adjourn the meeting?
Does anybody else have a question related to?
You guys fixed up your town hall. It's a beautiful building.
Thank you, we did. We did, we bonded, we're into our 7th year of paying debt, but,
We know that well.
I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
It's
Not a meeting.
Is there a second?
Just adjourn.
It's not a meeting.
Not a meeting,
Oh, I thought-
We don't need to.
so you just,
Kind of a
it
musical,
just,
I guess.
it just
We don't need to act
Adjourn.
on motion.
It was a training session.